We are back, and you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon. Is the BDS movement gaining some traction? Is any press better than no press at all? Oklahoma senator calls on his state to ban Ben & Jerry's. Ben & Jerry's decision to stop selling ice cream in the occupied Palestinian territories has enraged Israeli officials as well as pro-Israel lawmakers in the United States. Senator James Lankford, Republican from Oklahoma, has gone as far as calling for his state to outright ban Ben & Jerry's products. What are we to make of this? For insight, let's turn to our next guests. First, we're joined by the editor and co-owner at geopoliticsalert.com, James Carey. James, as always, welcome back.
Always good to be here.
We're also joined by an author and journalist working for peace and social justice. He writes extensively about U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East with a focus on Palestine. He is the author of Empire, Racism, and Genocide, A History of U.S. Foreign Policy. Robert Fantina. Robert, welcome back.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
So Ben & Jerry's, which has on a number of occasions made aggressive political statements and decisions, they decided to stop selling their ice cream in the criminally occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem in Palestine. They've, I believe, taken away the license of the distributor in that area. Now, Israeli officials, as well as pro-Israel lawmakers in the United States, they've got their shorts all up in a bunch about this decision. So I'm asking, under the often used adage, all press is good press, is this announcement by Lankford, at the end of the day, a good thing for the movement, Robert Fantina?
Yes, it is. Anytime that the BDS movement receives focus, whether that focus is positive or negative, it informs people about it. It helps them to understand why it exists, and it helps them to see that it's growing. Now, Ben & Jerry's is a well-known product, much loved throughout the United States. And because Ben & Jerry's has taken this stand and Senator Lankford has chosen to publicize it, that is a positive thing for the BDS movement.
Your thoughts, James Carey?
I agree. I don't see this as, the boycott's only covering the occupied territories, which it's not much, and I doubt those settlers were buying much of the liberal ice cream. But I do think it's good that Israel is, again, getting negative attention, as they have been the last year or so, pretty much consistently, even with the attempt to kind of wash over the new administration with this liberal veneer and pretend that Bennett is kind of a liberal. I think this is very good because it's another PR loss for Israel. Publicizing it and trying to violate the Constitution to get people to quiet down about it only makes it worse for Israel and their allies in the U.S. and the government.
In the greater context, Robert, there were a number of people, to James's point, that the decision by Ben & Jerry's was a limited decision, that if they were going to do this, they should have shut down all sales in the Zionist state of Israel.
Yes, I agree. That would have been a better move, certainly. But this is still a major move. This is still a major statement by a major company. And look at the attention that it has gotten in Israel, as the Israeli government has pounced on the fact that a U.S.-based company has chosen not to sell in the occupied territories yet. And this has been, the Israeli government is screaming about this. It would have been better and far more preferable and far more powerful if the Ben & Jerry's company had decided to cease all trade in Israel. And we may see that coming yet. We still have to watch, but this is the first step, and it's a significant step.
James, I can see, I guess on one hand, I could see Ben & Jerry's rationale in terms of the quote-unquote occupied territories, but understanding the whole idea behind the Zionist state of Israel, the Jewish state that they are trying to support, and the racism and the apartheid behind that, to me, justifies, well, you shouldn't sell to Israel, period. But is this a case where the statement or the action is more important than the resources behind it? That making the statement about the occupied territories is enough, even though it's not enough, if that makes sense.
I think so, because I think at this point it really does spur conversations about Israel proper, I guess you'd say. And I doubt the owners of Ben & Jerry's want, I don't think they're the type who'd say abolish Israel in reality. But I think that even when people do discuss the occupied territories, now discussions go back to things like the demolition of homes inside of Jerusalem. So I do think that every time we have this conversation, these older points get brought back up, especially when they're not that far in Americans' memory. We can't hold on to things long, but if it's constant, we tend to get at least some grasp of it. And I think that we call back to these conversations when things like this happen. So I do think it is a good move by Ben & Jerry's, and I think it does help.
Robert, looking at it now from American domestic politics, you've got Senator James Lankford calling for the boycott of Ben & Jerry's in Oklahoma. I don't know what their volume of sales of ice cream for Ben & Jerry's is in Oklahoma. Don't know if people in Oklahoma like Ben & Jerry's ice cream. But from a domestic political perspective, your thoughts. Does Lankford not realize the potential furor that he could create and that it could actually turn around and there would be incredible blowback to this move?
Yes, this is just a knee-jerk reaction for him. He said someone has dared to say or do something critical of Israel, and therefore that organization must be punished. Let's ban them, let's boycott them, et cetera, et cetera. Now, people are going to look at this and say, why is James Lankford talking about ice cream? What is the point of this? Doesn't he have anything more important to do? And then they might look farther into it or look deeper into it and say, well, it's about the BS movement, and if they're not informed about that, they may become informed about it. But basically, I think this shows that James Lankford is pretty preoccupied with Israel when he should be more preoccupied with the United States. And I think that will be obvious to many of his constituents.
Same question to you, James Carey. And is this a matter of who cares about Chunky Monkey or cookie dough chunks? Go ahead.
Again, I don't think I highly doubt with Ben & Jerry's past statements they were selling that well in the settlements anyway, where it's, they're rather right wing. Obviously, they chose to go to the settlements instead of Israel. But the thing is, I think that calling it out like this, yes, it does wake up people to the BDS movement who haven't heard of it before, people who are just learning about the Israel discourse. And I think that each time a reaction like this happens in the U.S., especially, come on, we're talking about ice cream, it continues to look more and more desperate when you're calling, Ben & Jerry's not selling ice cream and Israel is anti-Semitism. I think that the desperation is really what's making people take notice of these things, because they have the same reaction to criticism whether they're killing children or not getting ice cream. It's always anti-Semitism, you want Israel destroyed or whatever. So I think that, it's good to point out, because the more ridiculous these things get, the more Israel reacts. The more things pile up, the more outrageous Israel acts in response to them. And the way the U.S. shows that they're clearly more invested in whatever Israel is thinking than their own citizens.
Robert Fantina, Israeli president calls boycotts of Israel a new kind of terrorism. The rhetoric here, following up to James's point, the rhetoric here, to me, would be amusing if it weren't so inflammatory and serious. Israeli President Isaac Herzog called boycotts against Israel a new kind of terrorism after Ben & Jerry's announced it's going to stop selling ice cream at the end of 2022. When I think about actions such as boycotts, and I compare those actions to U.S. sanctions, when you want to talk about terrorism, because a lot of people say to me, well, look at the sanctions that were imposed on South Africa. I said, no, that's a slightly different political attack. Those were grassroots boycotts. People decided not to buy products from companies that were supporting those atrocities. That's not the United States government imposing sanctions, penalizing the people in those countries. Those are two totally different political actions. So if Herzog wants to talk about a new kind of terrorism, he needs to be talking about the United States sanctions policy, not talking about the BDS movement.
Yes, the U.S. sanctions against Iran, Venezuela, many other countries have had devastating impacts on the individual. We remember from the early 2000s when Madeleine Albright said that the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children due to U.S. Sanctions was acceptable to her. This is terrorism. And if Israeli President Herzog wants to talk about terrorism, well, he and his government are masters of terrorism in what they're doing to the Palestinian people and have been doing for decades. So the fact that a company has decided not to sell ice cream in the occupied territories doesn't reach the level of terrorism that dropping bombs on innocent children does. So he needs to get a little perspective here.
James Carey, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I think focusing on Israel itself, beyond just the IDF, the way they punish Palestinians via infrastructure in the West Bank and Gaza, these things like, oh, well, you'll have power, but there will be rolling blackouts. You only have it so many hours a day. You have water 4 hours a day because all these resources are being diverted to the settlements. And beyond that, as it brought up, the IDF shooting children in the head and being recorded laughing about it. These things happen. And I think that what is that? That's terrorism. That's much more terroristic than not being able to buy Ben & Jerry's in the West Bank if you're an Israeli. I think that's what the whole problem is. The U.S. people in the U.S. are finally starting to see that part of it, where it's like what Israel gets mad about often is so little in the grand scheme of things like this, whereas when people look into Israel, they see what they're doing to the Palestinians in these occupied territories, and I think it changes their minds on a lot of things.
There's another piece that I wanted to get to, and we'll have to do this quickly. Settlement activity under de facto freeze due to U.S. pressure. According to Israel Hayam's reporting, Prime Minister Naftali Bennett has halted the approval process for new projects at the request of U.S. officials. He has apparently slowed the approval process for construction in Judea and Samaria because of American pressure. Help me out. Is this real, Robert Fantina, or is what's actually happening a distinction without a difference?
It may be the latter. Israeli settlement expansion. The settlements are a crime. They're violation of international law. They're considered a crime against humanity. There's 700,000 Israelis living illegally on Palestinian land. So if he is placing some kind of temporary freeze on settlement expansion, it's not going to be anything that's going to remove any of the 700,000 there. It's just going to slow down the further division of Palestine by Israel. This is nothing significant. If it had been, we would have heard a lot more about it. Joe Biden is a Zionist. He isn't going to do anything to offend his Zionist puppet masters. So we'll see where this leads. I'm very skeptical.
We have 45 seconds, James Carey.
Yeah, I think the same thing. I think you'll see the construction. If it has stopped, it'll start back up again if heat dies down. The thing with Israel is keep the pressure up, and that's all we can do. Because if we let it go down, they will start this again.
James Carey and Robert Fantina, gentlemen, thank you both so much for your time. Really appreciate your analysis. Look forward to having you back.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Gentlemen, thank you. Folks, you're listening to The Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon. There's more on the other side. Stay tuned.